Today is the 7th session of Genesis to Exodus from Family to Nation with Rabbi David Silber. This class is part of Rabbi Silber's ongoing Tanakh series, recently finished Genesis and continuing into Exodus, focusing on the construction of the family of Israel and the formation of the nation, focusing on nation building in Exodus and the reflection of family and nation. For those who joining for the first time, Rabbi Silber is the Dean of Drisha, and if you've had the pleasure of learning with him before, thank you and welcome back. As previously mentioned, questions are always welcome, and when Rabbi Silber pauses, please feel welcome to ask questions. If you are a panelist, you can unmute yourself and speak directly. If you are an attendee, if you use the raise your hand function, I can unmute you. Or as always, you can ask questions in chat and I will bring them forward. If you have a Tanakh you prefer to use, please feel welcome to use that. We will be starting in Shemot today. Otherwise, I'll be sharing sources on screen from Sefaria with the JPS translation. And with that, I want to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you very much. Okay, we are starting a new book, the book of Exodus. Eila Shemot B'nai Yisrael Hab'im Mitzrayim. That's how it begins. These are the names. The question is, to what extent is it a new book? It certainly is a new book, and that's obvious from the fact that when you open up a Torah scroll, you can see that there are spaces in between the end of the previous book, which is Breshit, and the beginning of Sefer Shemot. Torah scroll itself, the fact that there are spaces, lines between the two books suggests, of course, that Sefer Breshit is a book unto itself. In the Gemara, they call it a Chumash. Chumash in the Gemara means each individual book of the Torah. There are 5 books of the Torah. So on one hand, certainly Breshit is and should be studied as a book unto itself. However, when we start the next book of the Torah, what we notice, and everybody who's looked at it before us has noticed as well, is that the book of Exodus, as we know it, Shemot, called the book of names, the Eila Shemot, these are the names. We notice that the first word of the book of Exodus is not Eila, but rather Ve'eila. The Vav is typically a connective. So Ve'eila Shemot suggests that we're continuing the previous book, and we're now continuing by saying, now these are the names. We've seen the story of Joseph and his brothers, Yaakov in Egypt. Now we continue with, now these are the names. So the Vav suggests to us that the book of Breshit does not conclude with the story of Joseph, but rather it continues with the next book. This is just a continuation of the previous book. I think that's important when we think about this, to think that both are actually accurate. That on one hand, certainly the book of Genesis is its own book, but that the book of Genesis, it continues with the next book. And to underscore that fact, that the book of Genesis continues, not just it happens to be another book, but it's a continuation of the story. One way to make that, I think, quite obvious is that when you jump to the end of this book, which is the book of Exodus, as it's known, Sefer Shemot, and the last chapters of this book, in fact, 12 of the last 15 chapters are about the command to build the Mishkan and the actual construction of the Mishkan, that when you read those chapters, you notice, presumably on your own, but if you don't notice it on your own, then various midrashim help us notice that much of the language in terms of the command to build the Mishkan and the building of the Mishkan is drawn from the first 2 creation stories in the book of Breshit, as if to say that somehow the realization of God's initial plan to create a world and to build within that world a special space that the Torah called Gan Eden, from which we humans have been evicted. But somehow the Mishkan is, in a sense, a return to that ideal. And since the book of Exodus concludes with a return to that ideal, it certainly suggests very strongly that one must read the book of Exodus in conjunction with the book of Genesis. And in fact, the book of Genesis, one might say, has 2 endings. It has its own ending at the end of Genesis, and it has the ending at the end of Exodus. And when you think about the two endings, they're actually diametrically opposite. Because the last word of the book of Breshit that we saw last week is the word Mitzrayim, a book that begins with Gan Eden, ends with Mitzrayim. And Mitzrayim is the opposite. Mitzrayim, is, of course, is precisely the opposite of the land of, it's the place in which God doesn't speak. It's the place of exile. That's how the book of Breshit ended. When you look at the ending of this book, of our present book, namely Shemot, that ends with a kind of, in a sense, a return to Eden, a return to an alternative Eden. So the two endings are not just different, but one might say diametrically opposed. And we have to read it both ways. We have to read Breshit as a book unto itself, and we have to read Breshit as simply a first chapter, one might say, in the larger narrative. That also suggests something else, that the 5 books of the Torah, that Breshit, Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Dvarim, we have to always think about how these 5 books work together. Because it's pretty clear that in some sense, the great narrative of Breshit ends at the end of Sefer Shemot. Then the question becomes, what about the other 3 books? How do they factor in? That's an interesting question. Anyway, for our purposes, as we begin the book of Exodus, or Shemot, as we call it, the first thing we notice is the first letter of the book Zavav, which often is a connective. Now there's something else about this first verse. V'elu Shemot b'nei Yisrael haba'im Mitzrayim eish Yaakov ishu beito bo. First verse says these are the names, and the Torah will enumerate the names of Jacob's children. Here they're called b'nei Yisrael, which is very interesting. These are the names of b'nei Yisrael who come unto Egypt, together with Jacob. Ish ubeito bo, each one came with his house or with his household. The word bayit can mean a house. It can also mean a household, members of the house. Yaakov spoke in the book of Breshit about his family as his bayit. He said to Lavan, listen, I've been working for you. Now I have to work for my own bayit. His own bayit means the members of his household. So Ishu Beito Bo here means, presumably, each one came with his family. He came down to Egypt. He came down, each one of Jacob's children came down with a bayit. And I would say, additionally, the first verse says something else. Each one came down with a name. These are the names. That's how the book begins. And the Torah and then now enumerates the names. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. In the next verse, Yisachar, Zvulun, Uvinyamin, Dan, V'Naftali, Gad, V'Yasher. It lists 11 of Jacob's sons in an interesting order. This is not usually the order in which they are listed. Benjamin is listed out of chronological order. He's the youngest, but he's listed after the 6 children of Leah. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zvulun are Leah's children. Then Binyamin is Rachel's child. Dan, V'Naftali, Gad, V'Yasher. 2 of them are the children of Bilhah, Leah's Amah, Shivcha. That's Dan and Naphtali. And Gad V'Yasher were Leah's Shivcha, named Zilpah. They were her children. And the one that's left is Joseph. So the next verse continues. B'shivim nefesh. Vahi kol nefesh yotzei yerech Yaakov shivim nefesh. V'yosef poya b'Mitzrayim. All the descendants of Jacob's descendants, called Yotzei Yerech Yaakov, I'll maybe reference that later, was 70. And Joseph was in Egypt. So it somehow includes Joseph. We're not going to get into the count now exactly how it's 70. But it's clear. You have Leah's children. You have Rachel's child, Benjamin. You have the 4 children of the Shpachot, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And then Joseph didn't go down to Egypt with them. He went down earlier. Joseph already was in Egypt. And the total is 70. Those are the first 5 verses of the book of Exodus. And we begin our study of Sefer Shemot with the following observation. We're hardly the first to notice it. What we notice is that the beginning of the book of Exodus, these verses actually are more or less a précis of what we find earlier, just a few chapters earlier, in the book of Breshit, chapter 46. Of Because if you turn back to Bereshit, chapter 46, and you begin to read from verse number 8, it is very striking. Chapter 46, verse 8, Jacob is on his way down to Mitzrayim. He leaves in Beersheba. God appears to Jacob in Beersheba. That's the beginning of chapter 46. And then we're told that Jacob came with his children and his grandchildren. He brought them all down to Egypt. He told Mitzrayim. That's the end of verse number 7. In verse number 8, we have an enumeration of all those who came down to Egypt. It begins in verse number 8, and it runs all the way through verse number 27. So verse 8 through 27 gives us the names of Jacob's sons, grandsons, etc. Some of the wives are mentioned as well. And it begins, V'ela Shemot, B'nei Yisrael Habayim Mitzrayim, Yaakov Uvanav, and then it gives the name. So V'ela Shemot, B'nei Yisrael Habayim Mitzrayim in chapter 46 of Genesis is precisely parallel to verse number 1 of the book of Exodus. And if you scroll down, you have the whole bunch of names over here, and it gives us the names of all the children, and they divide them by families. Keep scrolling down, 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 down. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going.
Which pasuk are you looking for?
We'll just keep scrolling. You'll get to it. These are all the names. This is Bnei Silber. Then we have Rachel, Yosef will be. The order is slightly different, but all the names. Keep going. And Joseph's children in Egypt. Keep going. Then we have Dan and Naphtali. Now that verse. Stop back. That's it. 26. Kol hanefesh haba liYaakov Mitzrayim yotzei Yerecho milvad neshei bnei Yaakov kol nefesh shishim v'sheish. So here it says all the souls who came down with Jacob yotzei Yerecho, apart from the wives, was 66. So that's strikingly similar to what we read at the beginning of Exodus. We read in the beginning of Exodus, so again, describes the children as the family is Yotzei Yerecho, his own issue. Here it's 70, here it's 66, but the next verse, one more verse, verse number 27, scroll down. That's it. Uvnei Yosef, asher yulad lo b'Mitzrayim nefesh shenayim, kol hanefesh l'beit Yaakov haba Mitzrayim shivim. Now, but Joseph was in Egypt, and there were 2 more, and the total is 70. How you get from 66 to 70 is not our problem. But what you must notice, it's obvious, is that the first few verses of the book of Exodus are essentially a recapitulation of these verses in the book of Bereshit, beginning in verse number 8 and concluding in verse 27. Yotzei Yerecho, going down with Jacob. Joseph is in Egypt already. The number of 70, etc. It's simply a shorthand for what we see earlier in Genesis chapter 46. And now the question is, what to make of that? What do you make of the fact that in this new book, it's simply a repeat of what we already know in chapter 46? So Rashi's bothered by this, of course. And Rashi gives a kind of midrashic response. Says Rashi, God loves the Jewish people. Something that you love, you want to constantly be in touch with. Some people love their money. They like to count their money. Why do they keep counting their money? Because they're very proud of the fact that they have money. It's very important to them. So they count their money. God counts the Jewish people, says Rashi. So yes, we were already told in chapter 46 of Genesis precisely the names and the numbers. But once again, with new book, we want to count it again. That's Rashi's midrashic answer, and typical of Rashi. Rashi is the great defense attorney of the Jews. And so that's Rashi's interpretation. But I would suggest something else here, which I think is actually an interesting suggestion, something to keep in mind. And that is that perhaps we have over here an example of what I call resumptive reading. And resumptive reading, we know this already. We're repeating it again as if to say, let's go back to when Jacob goes down to Mitzrayim, which is in chapter 46 of the previous book. And then many things happened afterwards. Jacob comes down, he meets Joseph, he makes Joseph swear to bury him back in his ancestral plot, back in the land of Canaan. And he speaks to Joseph, and he adopts Joseph's children, and he blesses all his children, and he blesses Joseph, and he instructs them, and Joseph and the brothers, and Joseph feeds Egypt, all those stories from towards the end of 46 to chapter 50. And now maybe what the Torah says is, okay, we read all that. That's fine. That's one reading. Now I'll give you a different reading. Jacob comes down to Egypt. And the next verse, and this is the number. These are the names. And now let's pick up the story from there. As if everything that took place in between never happened. Let's now read the Torah differently. Let's scratch out the end of 46, 47, 48, 49, 50. Forget that. Let's focus in on what happens when Jacob comes down. And here, if you read it this way, I think something else comes across which is very, very striking, which I'll get to. But I want to make that suggestion that what the Torah is really doing over here by taking us back to 46 and all the names and all that, and now it says, okay, now let's continue a different way. Not with the story of Joseph in Egypt and the Egyptians and the brothers and all that business and creating the family and the blessings, etc. Let's read it different, as if this is the next verse, and we'll see that actually will lead us to some very interesting interpretation, or to get us to focus very much on something that is very central to the first chapter of this new book. Okay, so that's where. Let me stop here for a moment to take comments or questions, and then we will continue, of course, with Sefer Shemot. Anybody have any comments or questions about anything that we have so far? Which is just the first three or four verses of chapter 1. The names, the listing of the names. The 70 descendants of Jacob. Yotzei Yerech Yaakov, the 70 souls. Joseph was already in Egypt. Yosef Yabba Mitzrayim. And we can continue. There's no need to. If you have questions, you can always speak up or chat or whatever.
And if you're an attendee, I can unmute you. You just need to ask me in chat or use the raised hand function.
Okay, now let us continue. Now the next verse. Vayomet Yosef v'chol echav v'chol hadarahu. Joseph and his brothers and the generation died. Vayomet Yosef b'chol echav b'chol hadarahu, which is verse number 6, and this is a very interesting verse. And I've spoken about this many times in the past. I'll repeat it though. I think it's a very important point. Joseph and his brothers and the generation died. And now the question is, why does the Torah mention the generation? Because the next story is Joseph and the brothers died. A new Pharaoh emerges. He didn't know Joseph, whatever that means. He begins to persecute the Jews. That's the story. Why does the Torah mention that Joseph and his brothers and the generation died? B'chol hadarahu. And I suggest that the Torah in these three words, B'chol hadarahu, is in fact intends to get us, the reader, to think about something which is going to be central to the story. And that is that we remember in the previous book in Bereshit, one of the central stories of the book is when God speaks to Abraham in chapter 15 and makes a covenant with Abraham called the Brit Ben Habatarim, the covenant of the pieces in chapter 15. And in that revelation of God to Abraham, God says to Abraham, you should know, Yadoa Teda, Ki yeh zaracha b'eretz lo lahem, your descendants will be strangers in a land not theirs. V'avadum v'inu otam 400 shana, and they were persecuted and oppressed, enslaved for 400 years. So, because Abraham had said to God, who had promised him a descendant and also a land, through what shall I know? That is to say, it's not saying how do I know. He's saying through what shall I know? What's our obligation? You made a promise to us. It's a covenant. Okay. Covenant has two sides. What's our obligation? Says God, you have a serious obligation. It's not a unilateral covenant. No covenant is unilateral, by the way. But anyway, the point is, it's two-sided. And that is, that Gerut, Avdut, and Inui. 400 years. And then God continued in chapter 15. You will die in ripe old age. But the fourth generation shall return to the land. So now what the Torah is setting up for us is the following. The experience in Mitzrayim is a covenantal experience, or potentially a covenantal experience. They're going to be strangers. They are strangers. They're going to be enslaved, and they're going to be persecuted. Gerut, Avdut, and Inui. And now the question is, if that be the case, it's Gerut, Avdut, and Inui, the question of the generation is very important, because God told Abraham that the fourth generation shall return to the land. The first three generations will suffer, as represented when we studied it together back in chapter 15, whatever that was, a while ago, made the point that Abraham is told to take three animals and cut them into pieces. Right? Eglam mishuleshet, eis mishuleshet, v'yayil mishulash. Cut them in pieces, and the fire will walk between the pieces. But the fourth pair, the birds, are not cut in pieces. And I pointed out at the time that these three animals cut in pieces, and the birds that are not cut in pieces are a perfect representation of the covenant. 3 generations of suffering, represented by the animals that are cut in pieces and almost devoured by the birds of prey that descend upon them. Abraham shoos them away. But the fourth pair is not cut in pieces. That is to say, 3 generations will suffer, but will not possess the land. The fourth generation will possess the land, and they never suffered. And the two sets of the 2 generations, the 3 plus the 1 together, they're part of the covenant. Each one needs the other. The suffering makes possible the possession of the land, and those that possess the land are obligated to look back at the people that made it possible. That's our covenant. That's what we have, a ritual which makes that point every year. It is the core ritual of the Jewish people. It's called the Passover Seder. So now you look at verse number 6 over here. Joseph and the brothers and the generation dies, and a new Pharaoh will emerge. He will begin to persecute the Jews. Avdut and Inui. And now the Torah says to us, my beloved reader, keep the number of generations in mind. With the death of Joseph and that generation begins the new generation, which is the generation of the Gerut and the Avdut and the Inui. And the Torah not only says it over here in these few words, but later on, in a very puzzling chapter in this book, it actually gives us a kind of partial genealogy of the Jewish people. In chapter 6, it starts with Reuven and Reuven's children, and then it gets to Shimon and Shimon's family, and then to Levi. And when it comes to Levi, it even gives the number of years that they live. And you have Levi, and then Levi has a son whose name is Kahat, and we're told how many years Levi lived, how many years Kahat lives. And Kahat has a son named Amram, how many years Amram lives. And Amram has 2 sons. One is Moshe and one is Aaron. And the Torah tells us how old they are when God speaks to Moshe and Aaron and asks them to redeem the Jewish people. And if you factor out, if you look at the generations, Levi is Joseph's brother, so he dies before the persecution. Then you have Kahat, that's generation number 1 of suffering. Then you have Amram, that's generation number 2 of suffering. Then you have Moshe and Aaron, generation number 3 of suffering. So we, the reader of the Chumash, in chapter 1, verse number 6, Vayomer Yosef b'chol echav b'chol hadarahu, we know more than Moshe. We're much smarter than Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe doesn't know this, but we know it. We know one thing, that the people that Moses takes out of Egypt, which are the people of his generation, and we can include Moshe and Aaron in this as well, they will never possess the land. Because God had said, the 4th generation shall return, not the 3rd. And our teacher Moshe is generation number 3, together with his brother. So he ain't going nowhere. He's going someplace, but he's not going to possess the land. It's only their children, who are the 4th generation, who will begin to possess the land. Now what will happen in the Chumash, in the story of Sichon and Og, and then they'll cross over and possess the rest of the land. That's the next book. So that's the significance of Vayomot Yosef B'chol Echav B'chol Hadarahu, the Torah, in a very understated way, gives us a very important piece of information. That Moshe's role is not going to actually be to bring us into the land. He may think that's his role. And the ultimate role, yes. But the main role of Moshe is to create the possibility of possessing the land and to take us out of Egypt. And the man's name is Moshe, means Kimina Mayim Mishituhu. The Egyptian named him Moshe, for she said, I have drawn him out of the water. So his task in life is to be a Moshe, to draw us out of the land of Egypt. One might say to draw us out of the waters, because the Hebrew boys were thrown into the water. And Moshe's job is to take us out of the water. That's his job. He doesn't know that. He may think his job is to possess the land. It's part of his job. He's not going to get that far, but he will be able to set it up. In any event, this is a very good example of it. Looks like a very innocuous verse. But it's filled with a very important, very important meaning, in a way, a preamble to the rest of the story of Israel in the desert, Israel in Egypt. Okay, let's take one more verse here, and I will stop and take comments or questions. Uvnei Yisrael paru vayishritzu vayirbu vayatzmu b'mod ba'od v'timalei haaretz otam. And now we're told about the children of Israel in the land of Egypt, and the Torah has all kinds of interesting language. Paru vayishritzu vayirbu vayatzmu b'mod ba'od. And the land was filled with them. When you read this verse, you can't help but remember verses in the very beginning of the book of Bereshit. In my little introduction, I talked about how the book of Exodus is a continuation of the book of Genesis. The end of the book of Exodus takes us back to the Garden of Eden. But these verses over here, Paru Yishmitzu Yerbu Yatzbu Batim Aretz Otam, reminds us of God's charge both to the human being in chapter 1, Pru Uravu, and also, and even more so, to the command that God gives Noah and Noah's family when they leave the ark. Shirtzu ba'aretz uravuba, Pru Uravu, etc. These are all taken from the biblical command, both in the first chapter of the Torah and also in the story of Noah, which is a recreation of a recreation story. And then we have the Paru vayishritzu vayirbu vayatzmu b'mod ba'od. Paru, Yirbu, Yishritzu. Here the Torah emphasizes the great growth. Ma'od ba'od. Mi'u et ha'aretz was the command in Genesis. Here it's Vatimalei ha'aretz otam. So it is actually very interesting that we now have deep connections to the book of Genesis, both in the very beginning of the book of Exodus, and of course the conclusion of Exodus, clearly connected to the story of Gan Eden and the first creation narrative as well. One might say that the book of Exodus, then, if we think in these terms, is also about creation. Not creation of the world, but creation of the Jewish people. That's what this book is going to be about. Yes, God creates the whole world. Yes, the whole world is God's creation. But the particular focus of the book of Exodus is the creation of the Jewish people. I'll just say now a small point to underscore this deep truth about the book of Exodus. And that is that if you look at the beginning of the Torah at Bereshit, so what strikes out in chapter 1 of Genesis talks about the transcendent God who creates everything, and the capstone of God's creation in chapter 1 of Bereshit is the seventh day, is the Shabbat. God rested from God's work on the seventh day. God sanctifies the seventh day, and God blesses the seventh day. But there's absolutely no sense when you read the Chumash and you read the first chapter of the Torah, there would be no sense that Shabbat would be a mitzvah that's a commanded to a particular group of people. Why in the world would that be so, given the fact that the first chapter of Genesis describes God's effortless creation of all, heaven and earth, capped by the seventh day, which God is resting and setting aside as separate, and sanctifying by Kadesh and blessing. There is absolutely no sense, no reasonable person could ever suggest that the Shabbat is not a mitzvah, if it is a mitzvah at all. describes what God does. But if the idea of the Torah is telling us this, that we should imitate what God did, no rational person would suggest that it's limited to any particular group of people. It's the most universal mitzvah possible. It describes God, who's the creator of all, not just human beings, but all the animals, all the plants, not just this world, but heaven and earth, of everything. And yet, when you come to the book of Exodus, to our book, the mitzvah that stands out as specifically a Jewish mitzvah, it's in the Ten Commandments, it's twice connected to the Mishkan, it's in the story of the Mon. It's one of the places we'll get to, but the fact is, if you had to pick out one covenantal mitzvah, after all, the Ten Commandments are a covenant. The tablets are the tablets of the covenant with a particular people. And the mitzvah that stands out, the great mitzvah that stands out in the book of Exodus, is the Shabbat. So there it underscores the fact that what you have in the book of Exodus is a focus not on God as creator of all, but the focus is God as a creator of this people. They are God's creation. That's not to say that it's limited to these people. No, anybody can join. Torah emphasizes that, and the rabbinic tradition even more so. It's not a club. It's not closed. It's actually a set of values. So anybody who wants to share those values can join. The Talmud takes it even further. I'm not getting into the Gemara now, but the fact is, just to re-emphasize something that's very important for our study, how the creation narratives of Breshit will play out in a very different way in Sefer Shemot. Okay, let me stop at this point.
Rabbi
Yes.
Silber,
Yep.
back to the idea of Aron, B'Mitzrayim. Those are two sort of narrow, deadened. Yes, there's a tzaddik named Yaakov in the Aron, and then you're catapulting to Peru, Uviyishritzu, to a more, people place, meaning the end sounds deadened and the end. But then we go right into the Peru, which is, birth of a nation.
That's right. Of course, the endings of Sefer Bereshit end with death, with Yaakov's death and his funeral, and then the last verse is the death of Joseph. He's placed in the Aron. Yes, the Aron, as I pointed out, is portable, so he's
Right.
waiting to be redeemed. But meanwhile, there he is. So,
and then the future
sure.
Aron, and then the future Aron, which again, Torah is alive, like Mayim. The same Aron becomes a transform.
Right, of course, yeah. The Mishkan is actually the Aron is the central vessel of the Mishkan. It houses the Luchot, etc. And for sure, it also travels with us. So we'll get to that, but that is very true. So it underscores the theme of creation, which is what we encounter in the very beginning of the book. Having said that, we'd right away jump into the slavery and the oppression. But what it is about is the creation of this people. Does anybody else want to make a comment?
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Yishratzu, and the root of Yishratzu, sheretz, is a
Yes.
verb. And so when I read that word, it struck me, like the land was full of vermin. Is there any significance to that, or is it just?
I don't know. I would say the following. First of all, it's not the first time it appears. The idea of multiplying like sheretz is found with Noah. Shirtzuba is a verse found in conjunction with Noah. Let me see if I can just quickly look back and see if I can find that verse for you. When God commands Noah, Shirtzu. So it's not the time it appears. You make a good point about the word Shirtzu. We identify it with sheretz and all that. Let me see if I can find this verse very quickly. Let's see. Yes, I have it. It's chapter 8 of Breshit, verse number 17. I believe it appears again. I think it appears twice, but verse number 17, V'shartzu ba'aretz ufaru urevu ala aretz. That's chapter 8, verse number 17. I'm pretty sure it appears a second time. Yes, and it also appears in chapter number 9, verse number 7. V'atem pru urevu, shirtzu ba'aretz urevu ba. So there you have it twice, actually. Shartzu, paru. I mean, I don't think it's to be seen negatively over here. I will pick this up later with another thought about this chapter. There are many thoughts about this chapter, but I think the emphasis over here, which the rabbinic tradition picked up, is the great multiplication. To multiply in enormous numbers, which is what's being, the word shirtzu is one. Vayatzmu bim'od ma'od, very, very much. The medrash that there were more than six were born at one time and all that. I think it's picking up on, among other things, the verb shirtzu. But I don't see it here as something negative. I mean, except to the extent, I'm not saying this is negative, but sometimes I think this is a factor in the chapter that I want to come back to. But sometimes when you have enormous growth, if you think about a business, have a family business, or family business, you hire a few people, they're working for you, you have 10 employees, everybody. You're working together, etc. And then something happens, goes public, who knows what. You don't have 10 employees, you have 1,000. And suddenly, it's a very successful company, but you don't know most of the people. There's so many people there, and it becomes a different kind of institution. You lose the personal sense. And I think part of what is a theme over here in this chapter, I believe, is that the book is about, we come down as a family. That's the first verse. We came down with Jacob, each one came with his house, and these are the names. So in verse number 1, everybody has a name. You know every person. It's like when I started Drisha, it was a small place, you know what I mean? They knew everybody. And now, after these many years, how many people have I taught? I don't know, 25,000? I have absolutely no clue how many thousands. I often don't remember people. I see the faces. I'm getting older too and forgetting, but you see the faces, you know them, or you know the name, but you never put the two together. And there are also people you probably don't know because some of the classes were very big, and 80 people in a class. You don't know. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but I'm saying it comes with the territory. And part of what happens over here is that when in this chapter, Israel will grow, but suddenly we'll discover, and we'll see this next week, I think, that suddenly the names have been lost. The second chapter of this book, nobody has a name. A man went from the house of Levi, marries a woman from the house of Levi, they have a child. What's the name? So there are no names given until the very end with Moses' name. You don't even know what his name. Even when he's born, he has no name. Even when he's taken back to the mother, she doesn't name him. So the point is, it comes with the territory of when you grow, when you have this enormous growth. That's the downside of the growth. You can very easily lose the personal touch. And I think that's part of what's going on over here, that there's a loss of name. To that extent, Shirtzu can be seen as something negative, I think. But per se, I don't think the intention is largely a negative one, but more to underscore the tremendous growth. The Shirtzu, the Paru, Rabu, Yatzmu, Ma'od, Ma'od, to emphasize, it's becoming a nation. That comes, when you're a nation, you've lost that sense of family. I think that I don't want to get involved in, the truth is, all I think about all the time is the situation in Israel for many, many, many reasons. My own personal family and our yeshiva in Israel. We have a yeshiva in Kfar Etzion, and they learn morning, afternoon, evening. It's amazing, even after October 7th. But you also do a lot of volunteer work. And where they took in a village from the south, Shlomit, and they were living in our dorms. It's not something abstract over here. We were supposed to move into our dorms. We're about to move into a new set of dorms. But they need place. So of course they take our dorms. So it's very personal. And my point about this is, when I think about Israel, I think about my brothers and sisters. I don't mean my own personal brother. To me, it's mishpacha. They're all mishpacha. You did this wrong, did that wrong. Oh, that may be true. No one's perfect. I mean, I'm getting into the narratives which are being put out there, which I think are largely not true. But the fact is, there's always some truth in everything. But the fact is, leaving that aside, these are our brothers and sisters. It's very simple. That's how I begin. It's my mishpacha. And yes, and that's very important, I think, not to lose that feeling that these are our brothers and sisters. That, I think, is in many quarters lost, sad to say. But there is a challenge when you have a big nation over here, and this is the point. We came down with individual people. It's a family. We know everybody's name. Each one is part of the bayit. And then with the tremendous growth, there are always dangers. And the danger here in the Chumash is that you can lose a sense of identity. You're a big number, but there's no longer this particular person. You're part of a group. And that's always dangerous. So I think that is part of the story here. I didn't want to get into the Israel situation, what's on my mind 24/7, obviously. But that is, I think, in the pshat of the Chumash, That is what takes place naturally. So the question which we'll deal with is, what happens to Israel and Egypt? To what extent do we remain Jews? That's a big question here in this narrative and other narratives. Part of the problem is the growth. There are other problems as well, which is the assimilation and also the persecution. Both of those can create a situation where you don't remember who you actually are. But we'll get to all these themes.
I had
Anyway.
another association with the word, which I don't think was meant, but I'll just share it.
Yeah.
That in the eyes of the pharaohs, like the eyes of the Nazis, they dehumanized the Jews because they were like vermin and to be killed,
I'm not sure that's, again, I'm not sure that I understand. I know what you're saying. I don't think it's exactly the same as that. But I do think that, I think it's seeing I'll pick up on your point, because the one that makes your point, actually, not the Nazis, but the point that makes your point is the Ramban. Is a very, very important Ramban. I'm not sure we'll get to it today, but there's a very important, maybe we will. There's a very important Ramban in a couple of verses from now, who makes an incredibly astute observation about the whole situation. And we'll get to this shortly. So leave your point, because it's a very central question. A new pharaoh will emerge, and what happens with the new pharaoh, and how this all relates to the growth of Israel. So again, your focus on Vayishritzu is interesting. And yes, Vayishritzu we would not see as a positive term. But my point is that it's not, I don't think it's actually negative in this context. But I mentioned one sense in which it is in a sense negative. That is, the very growth itself leads towards a lack, potential loss of identity. But I'll come back to your point, which is a very important point. Haven't forgotten it. The central here, and the Ramban picks it up. We'll see maybe in a few minutes even. Is anybody else with a comment or question, or we'll continue?
Nothing in chat?
Nothing. Okay, let's continue. Let's pick up with chapter 1. Verse number 8. Vayakam melech chadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef. Once again, these verses seem very innocent, but they're not. A new king emerged in Egypt who did not know Joseph. Asher lo yada et Yosef. And here we come to a very important point about the book of Exodus. I think it's also true in the book of Genesis, and that is, when you're reading these stories, the Torah is very economical with language. And one way in which the Torah will express its themes and its meaning is by use of keywords. There are certain words that are keywords in the book. That's in the Torah, that's certainly the case. Sometimes the word is repeated many times. Sometimes the word appears in many different contexts. And one of the keywords that appears in both in the book of Bereshit and the book of Shemot. In the book of Shemot, I think it is the key word, actually, but it may even be the key word in the book of Bereshit, and that is the little word yada, to know. I mean, the Torah does begin with the story of the Garden of Eden and the banishment from Eden and the partaking of the Eitz Hadat, tree of knowledge. Yada has many meanings, sometimes even a sexual meaning. Yada has multiple meanings that we will encounter in the book of Shemot, and many meanings that it has in the book of Bereshit. For example, that we just recently studied, where Jacob blesses Manasseh and Ephraim. We talked about that at some length. He includes Joseph through Joseph's children, but he puts his right hand on the head of Ephraim and the left hand on the head of Manasseh. And Yosef thinks he's making a mistake, doesn't know what he's doing. This old guy doesn't know what he's doing. He tries to pull his hands off the head of the children and reverse the hands. And Jacob, no, father, this is the oldest one. You're making a big mistake. And Jacob says to Joseph, Yodati b'ni Yodati. My son, I know. He repeats, Yodati b'ni Yodati. I know what I'm doing. You may think I don't know, I can't see, I'm blind, or whatever. I know perfectly well. And we recall the earlier Yodati of the book of Bereshit, when Jacob had his dream. He read it recently in the shul. He wakes up in chapter 28. He had dreamt about a ladder to heaven, angels walking up and down the ladder. The place is, Jacob wakes up. God is in this place. I did not know. And Jacob's mission in life, among other things, his mission is to return to the land and to build the bayit and all that, but also to put himself in a place where he can truly know. And in the story of Joseph, the blessing of Joseph through the children, which enables Jacob to fulfill his dream of including the whole family, there you have the Yodati. Yodati b'ni Yodati. The word Yodati is a critical word in Bereshit, and it's the critical word in the book of Exodus. And here's my point. A new king emerged in Egypt who did not know Joseph. Asher lo yodad Yosef, not knowing is not an intellectual failure on the part of Pharaoh. It's a ethical and religious failure. Not to know somebody. In this case, what could it possibly mean he didn't know Joseph? He didn't know him personally because Joseph died. But it wasn't he doesn't know Joseph. Joseph not only saved Egypt, but Joseph empowered the Pharaoh. This new Pharaoh has his power because of Joseph. Joseph maneuvered over to Pharaoh, for better or worse, all the money, all the cattle, and all the land. He doesn't know Joseph. And we are reminded, and the Medrash picks this up, when Moshe goes to Pharaoh later in this book and says, we Jews have to serve our God, give us a 3-day vacation to serve God and to serve Hashem. What does Pharaoh say? Lo yodati es Hashem. I don't know this God. Lo yodati. Lo yodah in the book of Shemot, not to know, is a moral failure. So the point is, you read it, he didn't know Joseph. Okay, never met him. No. That's true. But the Torah wants you to ask the question, wait, he doesn't know him. Doesn't know of Joseph, what Joseph did. I mean, hello? What does that mean? What kind of person is this person? Well, we find out what kind of person he is right away. He doesn't know, he doesn't want to know. He doesn't want to owe anybody anything. He has the IOUs, they don't, maybe it's in the history books, he puts it aside someplace. He doesn't want to know about that. And therefore, we have the continuation in the next verse. Vayomer Ramo, he says to his people, Hinei am b'nei Yisrael, Rabbi yotzum mimenu. He says to the people, to his people, Amo, not the Jews. Talks about b'nei Yisrael as the other. Look here, he says, the children of Israel are more great and numerous than we are. Rabbi yotzum mimenu. The point is that, first of all, presumably that can't be true. How could it be true? As much as Paro vayishvatzu vayirbu vayatzmu, they still are strangers in a strange land. So presumably, it's not really true. And the proof is in the pudding, because very soon they'll be subjected to all kinds of slavery, and suddenly this so-called powerful nation will be a bunch of slaves. So but the imputation over here is that somehow they become, by hook or by crook, more powerful than we are. This is an accusation the Jews have been in the receiving end of forever, it appears. And Rabbi Yatsu Mimenu. So therefore, what should we do? In the next verse, which is verse number 10, scroll down, Rabbi, this is the verse. Hava nitchak malo. Let us outsmart them. Let's deal shrewdly with them. Pen your bear. V'yoki tikrena milchama, v'nosafkam hu al sonenu, v'nucham banu, v'yalam min haaretz. Okay, this is an interesting verse. Verse number 10 has many pieces to it. So let's look at the different pieces of verse number 10, and then I'll mention what the Rabban has to say over here. So first of all, hava nitchak malo, here they translate, let us deal shrewdly with them. Nitchakma, from the word chachma, let's outsmart them. We are reminded, by the way, when you read hava nitchak malo, let's use chachma to harm them. To deal shrewd means to suppress them. And we remember that Joseph was chosen by Pharaoh for his job, because Joseph said to Pharaoh, you should choose someone who's very wise to help you, to figure out how to deal with the famine that will hit after 7 years. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God speaks to you, ein navon v'chacham kamocha, acharei hodia Elohim et kol zeh, ein chacham v'navon kamocha. Since God, again, hodia, since God gives you knowledge, hodia. There's no one wiser than you. You have the data, you have the knowledge, you're the chacham. And therefore, you do what you're going to do, and Pharaoh knows what he will do. He will save Egypt, save Pharaoh. He'll empower Pharaoh. And now we have the very chachma. Let's outsmart them. Again, the reader reads this and says, 1 second. It was the very chachma of Joseph that enabled Pharaoh to become what Pharaoh is today. So the sense of ingratitude is underscored by the Hava Nitchak below. And of course, another play in verse number 10 on the Joseph story, because the accusation is that if war will come, there are a fifth column. V'nosaf kam hu al sonenu. Here the Torah again plays with Yosef. Asher lo yodat Yosef. He didn't know Joseph. He didn't know how loyal Joseph was to Pharaoh. One might argue he was too loyal to Pharaoh, but he was certainly loyal to Pharaoh. And now the accusation is of disloyalty. V'nosaf al sonenu. They're going to join up with the enemy. They see themselves as other, as different. They're going to join up with the enemy and fight against us. V'nucham banu. And v'yalah min haaretz is not clear what that means. It could mean they will then leave the land. You might say, what's so terrible if they leave, if they're our enemy? But of course, contradictions never bothers the anti-Semite. They're going to leave us. Let them leave. It could mean that, or it could mean something else. That v'yalah min haaretz doesn't mean they're going to leave, but they'll rise up from the land. That is to say, they'll be even more powerful than they are now. They will rise up. It's not clear whether v'yalah min haaretz means they'll leave. He's afraid they will leave and they'll lose the workforce, and they'll lose all the wisdom and they'll lose the assistance that they get, or it means something else to simply rise up. That's unclear. But anyway, this is the verse. So the new Pharaoh emerges and he says, Hava nitchak b'lo. Okay. So now let me tell you what the Ramban says about this verse. And I'll stop and take comments or questions, then we'll finish up for today. Ramban has a simple question. Says the Ramban, I don't understand this verse. Pharaoh is concerned that Pharaoh presents to his people that the Jews are actually an enemy. They're a fifth column. They're going to join up with the enemy. They're going to fight against us. Okay. And eventually, later on, a few verses later, first he instructs the midwives that upon the birth of the children, if they're there, to kill the boys. And then later he tells all his people, just a few verses later, because that doesn't work, because the midwives refuse to listen. So a few verses after that, he says to the Egyptians, throw the boys into the water, drown them in the Nile. The girls, but the girls keep alive. Okay, we'll get to that verse, keep the girls alive, later. So the Ramban asked the question, I don't understand. If you're concerned they're the enemy, and apparently you have no moral qualms about murdering children, so just tell the people, the Jews are dangerous, take their children and drown them, kill the babies. What is this biz of Hava nitchak b'lo? We have to outsmart them. Then he goes to the midwives. No one's going to know the difference upon birth. Birth is dangerous. Why go through all this business? Why not just kill them straight out? Then you'll solve your problem. There are too many of them, so kill them upon birth. That's the point. There are too many. The birth rate is too high. Okay, he's going to kill them. Kill a good number of the babies. What's a Hava nitchak b'lo? Let's outsmart them. That's the Ramban's question. Says the Ramban, very important Ramban. It's important in Chumash and in general. Says the Ramban, Pharaoh at this point couldn't do this. Because the fact of the matter is that everybody knew that Joseph was the savior of Egypt. I mean, that's what they say to Joseph back in chapter 47 of the previous book. They said to Joseph, you have kept us alive. You have saved us. You've given us a way to, in some sense, keep our land. Okay, we give a fifth to Pharaoh. But we still have our land. We can still survive. And you have kept us alive. That's what the people said. So the Ramban says, Joseph was a national hero. He saved Egypt. You can't turn around the next day and say, kill all the Jews. That's not going to work. Nobody will accept it. So the Ramban says, therefore, Hava nitchak b'lo, let's outsmart them. Before you kill all the Jews, before you kill you, first thing to do is to dehumanize. You think they're the threat. You think they're good? They're really the enemy. And that sets up the possibility. Of actually someday once you have all the propaganda, and the propaganda takes place over time, and people don't even realize it. It takes place over time. It's very insidious until one day, all this propaganda, then it all hits the fan. And then it becomes possible to do all kinds of things that people imagined years ago was impossible. But it's very possible because now the Jew is seen differently. Happened over time. That's what the Ramban says. I would add to this point of the Ramban, which I think is a really important pshat in Chumash. He says the pshat in Chumash, but we all know that it has all kinds of implications throughout Jewish history and other people's histories as well, not only the Jews. But I wanted to point out something else, that in the Haggadah, in the Passover Haggadah that I, many years ago, put out a Haggadah first in English, then translated to Hebrew. And so in that Haggadah, I made the point that the Haggadah, among other things, the four key verses in the Haggadah, taken from the Pilgrim's Prayer in the chapter 26 of Devarim, Arami Oved Avi, and the Haggadah has drashot on the verses, because the Mishnah tells us in Psachim to read this parsha and to make drashot. The verse, the first verse describes coming down to Egypt, and the next verse describes what happened to us in Egypt. Chapter 26 of Devarim says, "Vayareu otanu hamitzrim vayanunu." Vayareu, Ra. The Egyptians harmed us. Vayanunu, they persecuted us. Vayinu aleinu avodah kasha, and they placed upon us difficult work or slavery. So in that verse it says, we came down to Egypt, they harmed us, they did bad to us. The Inoi, and you have Avdut. That's what the second verse of the Arami Oved Avi says. Avdut and Inui, those are two of the three covenantal terms. That's what it says. But the Haggadah that we have provides with drashot. It says, Vayoreu otanu hamitzrim. It cites a verse in Devarim, chapter 26, the one who brings the first fruits. So the pilgrim says, the Egyptians, Vayoreu otanu, from the word Ra, they harmed us, they did bad to us. Kemoshe Ne'emar. Remember what it says, as it is written. And the Haggadah cites the verse from a different verse from the Torah. This verse, our verse, chapter 1 of Exodus, verse number 10. Hava nitchak b'lo pen yirbeh. V'yoki tikrena milchama v'nosaf kamu al sonenu v'nucham banu v'yolam min haaretz. Says the Haggadah, this is the text, the proof text for the three words that the pilgrim says, Vayoreu otanu hamitzrim. So in the Haggadah, I make the following point. First of all, why does the Haggadah need to cite a verse in the book of Exodus to corroborate a verse in the book of Devarim? You can believe me, I'm quite certain that the one who wrote the Haggadah, nobody knows who it is. But whoever did this Haggadah, it's the core Jewish text, the ritual, and no one knows who wrote it. But in fact, whoever wrote it, I'll guarantee you, did not believe in the documentary hypothesis, did not believe that a verse from the book of Exodus has any more force, any more legitimacy than a verse from the book of Devarim. The academics may talk about E and D and J, but believe me, whoever put the Haggadah together believed that the word of God is true in Sefer Devarim just as much as in the book of Shemot. So what do you mean you're citing a verse as it is written, as if it needs proof? What doesn't it need proof? It says it in Devarim. The Egyptians, Vayareu otanu hamitzrim. But the point is something else. I'm not the only one to make this point. That what the Haggadah is doing is not citing a verse to corroborate. The Torah needs no corroboration. It's citing a verse to interpret. And what bothers the Haggadah actually are the three words, Vayoreu otanu hamitzrim. The Egyptians, we would translate the Egyptians harmed us. But what bothers the Haggadah is that usually when you have the verb lahara, to harm someone, in biblical Hebrew, 90% of the time, it doesn't take the accusative, the otanu, which is the accusative, the direct object, but it takes what's called the ablative, I think, the genitive, to. In Hebrew, you would say, Vayoreu lanu hamitzrim. The Egyptians did harm to us. What is Vayoreu otanu hamitzrim? So the Haggadah offers a different interpretation. It doesn't mean what you think it means. It doesn't mean the Egyptians harmed us. It means Vayareu Otanu. The Egyptians ascribed evil to us. Not that they did evil to us. They ascribed to us evil. As it is written, and that's the verse, that Pharaoh said to his people, Hava nitchak malo. And over here, verse number 10 of Hava nitchak malo precedes what happens next, which is Avdut and Inui. Right away, you'll see the next verse is about Avdut and Inui. So the point of the Haggadah is, so clever, is to interpret one verse in light of another. And for the Haggadah says, what made possible the Avdut and Inui, says the Haggadah. What made that possible is, in fact, the Hava nitchak malo. As the Ramban says, they couldn't have done it right away. Why were you harming innocent people? Innocent? You think they're innocent? Don't you know X and Y and Z and this and that? And over time, people begin to believe it. And then someday you wake up and it's a fact. It's a fact. What fact? It's a fact. And this is what makes possible the Avdut and the Inui. That's the Ramban. Very relevant Ramban. So that's what the Ramban says. Okay, let me make another point now about the one last point about let's just read a couple more verses. Okay, let's scroll down, keep going. Next verse. Then it says, Vayosimu olav, next verse. Vayosimu olav sarei misim l'man anoto b'sivlotam. Vayiven arei miskenot l'paro et pitom v'yetram seis. One more verse. Scroll down, one more verse. V'chasher ya'anu oto ken yirbe v'chen yifrots. Vayakutsu mipnei b'nei Yisrael. Even as they were oppressed, the more they increased, they grew even more. Vayakutsu. The Egyptians came. Vayakutsu is hard to know what that means. They translate dreaded. They began to dread mipnei b'nei Yisrael. There's a lot to say about these two verses. So let me begin, say a few things about them. And we'll continue with this next week. This is a very important, first chapters are always important. So first of all, the first thing that you see over here, the first thing that Pharaoh does after he makes the proclamation, they're really dangerous, they're a fifth column, join with the enemy and all that, the first thing he does is puts it to place Inui, right? He appointed taskmasters, Laman Anoto B'Sivlotam, Vayiven Arei Miskenot L'Paro et Pitom V'Yetram Seis. It's interesting. He placed over their taskmasters, right, in order to Inui, and they built store cities. What it sounds like in the Chumash, and this is, I think, corroborated later, a few chapters later, is that the building of the cities, the store cities, again reminds us of what Joseph said to Pharaoh, that you should take all the food and you should place it under your control, right? Over here, it's building Pitom and Ramses. But the point of the Chumash is that the real intention of Pharaoh was not the building. It's not that we have a building project and it requires a lot of schlepping and a lot of hard work. You want to build pyramids, but it requires a lot of manpower to do it, and you got to work 20 hours a day, etc., etc. No, says the Chumash something else. The building was not the purpose was not the building. The purpose was the oppression. The building was a way to oppress. That may sound crazy. I mean, that sounds nuts. No, he wants to build cities. He's going to work them very hard to do it. He doesn't care how hard they work. And therefore, that's the Inui. But I think the first possibility that I mentioned, which is that no, he wants to oppress them. And the building of the cities is just a way to oppress them, is actually borne out by what you find later in this book. Because later in the book, when Moshe goes to Paro and says, listen, we need a 3-day vacation to serve our God, and Pharaoh says, you're just lazy. I'm going to make it even more. He tells the taskmasters, make them work even harder. So the taskmasters go to the Jews in chapter 5, and they say to them, or they go to the Jewish representatives, and they say, you've been making bricks, and we've been providing you with straw. And you produce a certain number of bricks a day. Let's pick a number. It doesn't matter. 20 bricks. You produce 20 bricks a day, we give you the straw. But now, we're not giving you any straw to help make the bricks. You have to find your own straw, but you still have to produce 20 bricks. And if you don't, you're going to be punished. So the people go out, scatter about to find the straw. It's hard to find the straw. They come back, they get some straw, but they can't make 20 bricks a day. So they make fewer bricks a day and they're beaten. Now, here's the point. If I were Pharaoh, God forbid, if I were Pharaoh, I would say something different. How many bricks you make a day? 20 bricks a day? Okay. You're complaining? Make 25 bricks a day. That's what I would say. But no, he doesn't do that. He makes it impossible to produce 20 bricks, actually. So they get less production out of it, not more production out of it. That makes sense if your purpose is Inui. Because you don't care how many bricks they actually make. That's just the excuse. That's what Pharaoh's about. Any normal ruler, even a horrible person, would say, okay, to work harder. How many hours you work in a day? 12 hours a day? You work 14. You work 17 hours. No vacation. That would make sense. You want a vacation? 3 days off? On the contrary, work more hours. That would be the normal response of a terrible person. But Pharaoh has a different response. You need the straw to make the bricks, you make the same number without straw. You find your own straw. So of course they can't do that. So the building can't go on the way it went on once, which makes sense if the purpose was Inui. Now the question is, so here we have the Inui. Remember, in the covenant of the Brit Ben Habitarim, when Abraham had said to God, and God said, Yodoa Teda, they'll be enslaved and subject to Inui. That's the covenant of the pieces, chapter 15. Make sure you memorize those verses. Chapter 15. So here's what's interesting is the following. Of course, you have Inui in verse 11 and 12. And the next verse you have Avdut. Of course, the very next verse you have Avdut. 5 times Avdut, in fact. Vayavidu Mitzrayim. But let me just raise the following question, which is this. That the order in the covenant of the pieces, when God speaks to Abraham, when Abraham said, through what shall we enter into this covenant? And God said, you'll be Ger. And then Avdut and Inui. So the order was Ger, then Avdut and Inui. But the order in chapter 1 of Exodus, in our chapter, is there's no Ger here. Leave out Ger. Next is Inui in verses 11 and 12. Inui twice. Man Anoto in verse 11, Kasher Yanu in verse 12. And the next verse, in verse 13, you scroll down, you'll see it for yourself. The next verse, Vayavidu Mitzrayim Avdut. In verse 14, you have it several times. Avoda Kasha, Avoda Basada, Avoda Tam, Asher Avdu B'farach 5 times. 5 and 2 is 7. That's a number that appears often. But the point is, first Inui and then Avdut. Why did the Torah switch the order? Why Inui and then Avdut? Why not Avdut and then Inui? And by the way, in the verses in Devarim, in the Haggadah, so there it's also Vayareu otanu hamitzrim vayanunu vayitnu olenu avodah kasha. First Inui and then Avdut, which parallels, of course, the verses in chapter 1 of the book of Exodus. Why the switch? Why Inui and then Avdut? So I have a suggestion. I think it's in the Haggadah. I'm pretty sure. I don't remember anymore. It's quite a while ago. I think the Hebrew Haggadah, its translation of the English, we also made a few changes there. Anyway, I like them both. What I suggested is this, that Inui is a word. Inui means persecution, suffering. But Inui very often deals with basic human needs. Inui is often sexual. It's some kind of, it could be rape, it's possible, but it means some kind of inappropriate sexual situation. When Leah had her first child, Reuven, Ra Hashem ba'anyi, she said, God has seen my Inui. Because what does Leah mean? What she means is, something's not right here. I'm married to this guy, and a week later, he marries my sister. And not only that, he loves her more than he loves me. That's Inui. I've been put maybe by my father, by my husband, who knows? in an inappropriate situation. That's Inui. The point of Pharaoh here then, what Pharaoh is concerned about is too many children. The Jewish birth rate is too high. So that's what he's dealing with. What he's dealing with is, first of all, we got to limit the births. So the idea of the Inui, the labor, the hard labor, is intended one way or the other to limit the possibility of having children. The Midrashim pick up on this right and left. And that in the terms of the pshat, I think that is the pshat. And I would just conclude with the following drasha. But there are two kinds of drashas. There's a drasha, someone gets up in the shul and says, in this week's parsha, it says X, Y, and Z, and then it launches into a discussion about Donald Trump or whatever, or some other situation. So it's not about the parsha. It's about, they want to make a statement about, it could be a very important statement, but they want to connect it in some way or other to the parsha. It's a drasha. No one believes it's in the parsha. Someone wants to talk about the current events or whatever, or give mussar, or maybe say great things, but it's not really about the parsha. That's what kind of drasha. Then there's another drasha. In this case, I say that the Torah has a drasha for us, and a good one too. The Torah has a drasha. It's not obvious, but I believe the Torah has a drasha. Because the introduction to this whole persecution, before the Havan Nitchak Malo, the king emerged in Egypt who didn't know Joseph. Oh, we talked about that. We didn't know Joseph. And then great. Doesn't one know Joseph? Whatever. Rewriting of history. But I think the Chumash has something else in mind. In addition to that, he didn't know Joseph. This is a drush, but it's the Chumash's drush. Because what does the Torah tell us about Joseph? Joseph had two sons. The first he named Menashe. I want to forget my father's house. I want to forget my past. But the second one he called Ephraim. He called the second son Ephraim. Ephraim means fertility. Pru Revu, Ephraim, right? Ki Ephrani Elohim, because God has made me fruitful, be Eretz on ye, in the land of my persecution. What Joseph is saying is, even with the persecutions, even, yes, I'm a big shot in Egypt, but I was also a slave in Egypt. And I went through terrible ordeals in the land of Egypt. And it's a place where people call me the Ivri. I know what it is. And you would think it wouldn't stop me from living a full life. But no. Even with the Oni, even with the Onyi, Ifrani Elohim be Eretz Onyi. That's the drush of the Chumash. That the king emerges who doesn't know Joseph. Doesn't have the quality of Joseph. You can be ma'ana the Jews all you want. But the fact of the matter is they have the ability to bounce back. Ifrani Elohim be Eretz Onyi. That's the drush of the Chumash. That's the Chumash's drush, and I got to say, it's a pretty good drush. It's a drush that actually is the pshat. In other words, it's actually in the text. It's not the primary significance of the text, but it is the significance. But the point is, the reversal of the Inui and the Avdut is for a reason, because the Inui addresses what bothers Pharaoh initially. Why they're so dangerous? Because there's so many of them. So we have to limit this. It's the attempt to limit the births. And the next thing is the midwives. It's the same thing. It's limit, throw the boys into the ocean or whatever, into the Nile. The attempt to limit. So something to think about, and I'll stop at this point, is that you have in the Chumash 5 or 6 times in the Chumash, you have this the triad of Gevut, Avdut, and Inui. And so what's interesting to think about is the order in which we encounter them. Here we have an interesting point about the Inui, which precedes the Avdut. So next week we'll continue with the first chapter, with Pharaoh's plan to enslave the Jewish people. End of the day, it works for a long time. Enslaves the Jewish people, story of the midwives, and then the birth of Moshe in chapter 2. We'll keep moving along. So, yes, we have completed the book of Breshit, which of course continues with Sefer Shemot. I have a friend of mine that when we finish reading the Torah, finish Breshit, every he cries. Doesn't want to leave the book of Genesis, and I understand that completely. But the book of Exodus isn't chopped liver either, you know. It's a great book. And it's actually part of the same book. It's actually a continuation, builds upon the first book. Maybe next week I'll discuss another Ramban who talks exactly about that point, about one book building upon the other. Anyway, if there are any last comments or questions, I'll take them, and we'll stop here. and
In the
continue next time.
In the future, perhaps you'll discuss, because if you say achein noda davar, there too is yeda, and maybe the moral failure of Moshe is that he was in that palace too long, in addition to seeing, the trials and tribulations. That's for another day, maybe.
Right, you have achein noda davar. You have noda throughout the whole book. By the way, it appears it's the central word of the book, which we'll get to. But
Right.
yeah, I'm not sure Moshe has a moral failure there. But okay, we'll talk about that. I think that.
But he left very late. He stayed at the fair very long.
And we'll talk about Moshe with Paro. That is
Yeah.
an interesting issue over there, how he deals with Paro. That's true. He doesn't. We'll get to it. You make a good point. We'll discuss that. We're going to just want to mention again, we have the Bohm lecture this evening. Ken will give us some information about that. My own class at 1 o'clock on the Mishnah, all kinds of good things happening. Okay, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining. This class will continue next week. 2 classes I want to highlight. We have 2 classes that started last week and one of which is very timely. Hanukkah Holiday of Homebodies meeting on Tuesdays at 8 p.m. with Rabbi Leah Sarna, and Technologies of Transmission meeting Wednesdays at 8 p.m. with Rabbanit Sarah Wolkenfeld, which you can find out more on our website. You can also find out more about our annual Renee and Alexander Bohm Memorial Lecture taking place tonight, Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern, and it is going to be on the topic of nature and the supernatural in medieval Ashkenaz with Dr. David Shiowitz. And the link to sign up is in chat. If you have not signed up already and you are in a time zone where this works for you, I do recommend it. It looks to be a very interesting class. And if you can't, then good evening, good afternoon, good morning. I hope to see you all next week. All right, take care.
Thank you, Kayla.